Some crimes are so heartbreaking or shocking that they change laws, change society, or even earn the label crime of the century. But the stories that made headlines in decades past aren't necessarily remembered today. I'm Amber Hunt, a journalist and author, and in each episode of this show, I'll examine a case that's maybe lesser known today, but was huge when it happened. This is Crimes of the Centuries. Something was wrong. Awakened at 4 that Saturday morning by the ship's bell signaling an early breakfast, then finally Havana in the near distance over the port side, the vessel's passengers scrambled out of bed. Barely visible, a few headlights would briefly light the dark so everyone could see the shoreline. There it was, their new home. Herb Carliner, then a young boy on board, would later tell CBS Miami,
With Cuba, it was beautiful. We had all our suitcases ready in front of the door. And then all of a sudden, the Cuban police came on the ship and says, we have to check all the papers.
The ship, the MS St. Louis, had sailed 2 weeks earlier, on May 13th, 1939, leaving Hamburg, Germany, with Adolf Hitler's express permission. On board were 937 people of Jewish descent who had paid dearly for exit visas to leave their homeland and entry visas to enter this new tropical place that was to be their shelter from all they had suffered in the years since the Führer and his brown-shirted thugs had taken over. The years since 1933 had meant constant denigration and an ever-increasing realization that Jews, who were blamed for everything wrong in their country, would never be safe. It wasn't just that they couldn't own businesses, couldn't act as doctors or lawyers or bankers or engineers, couldn't live in their own homes, couldn't walk safely through the streets they had grown up in, couldn't protect their children, couldn't find enough food, and couldn't know from one day to the next if they were to be rounded up and placed in camps. Famed Nazi hunter and concentration camp survivor Elie Wiesel explained why the ship was allowed to sail.
Strange as it may sound, now, surely, just as Jews wanted to leave, the German authorities wanted them to get out. Hitler's goal was not yet extermination, but racial cleansing.
Some Jews stayed on in their native land because they simply couldn't believe any of the persecution was permanent. Others had no such faith. They had already left. The men and women and children on the cruise ship St. Louis had waited a very long time to go, but they had finally gotten away. Wiesel again.
The moment the vessel left the shore, the passengers' mood became good, uplifted, cheerful. The uncertainty of their future didn't bother them. What was certain was that they would not have to endure any more vicious German anti-Semitism. They knew that far away in Cuba, their immediate destination life would be bearable at least.
There are photos of the crowded St. Louis at its launch, its deck filled with smiling passengers waving goodbye. Many of the beaming faces were children's. The ship's journey was more subdued, of course, but once the vessel neared its destination, those aboard began to rejoice in the land they saw, until they noticed that the ship had not pulled up to the dock where passengers usually met their families and unloaded their bags. Sol Menninger turned 7 on the ship. Later, he recalled to the CBC in Canada,
They weighed the anchor in the harbor. People said, well, we're getting off the ship. Why are they laying anchor in the harbor? We should have pulled up to the pier.
They were there, but not quite. Maybe they needed to be checked by local doctors. Maybe their papers needed to be submitted to the authorities. Maybe there was already a ship in the quay where they were supposed to tie up. Maybe the ship's papers were amiss. Captain Gustav Schroeder knew better. He had been fielding cables 2 days after they left Germany that said, quote, "The situation in Cuba was now fluid," end quote. The captain asked for clarification. Eventually, he realized the Cuban authorities were waffling about allowing his Jewish passengers to deboard. Something about a presidential decree that said no more refugees would be allowed on the small island, which had its own problems with unemployment. Schroeder also knew that refugee agencies had been tapping Cuban ministers, military leaders, police, and dignitaries to allow these people who had legitimate visas to enter the country, to get off his ship safely. He had told only a few on board of the new problem. Soon enough, he would have to tell them all.
The next day, we found out that the Cuban government had invalidated our visas. Just said they don't exist. We had paid for them. We had paid for passage on the ship. So everybody was very depressed and scared. You know, we knew if we went back to Germany, we had no home to go back to. We had nothing to go back to. We'd be put in a camp.
And that was understood by both the Jews and the captain to be equal to a death sentence. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Smalls. I told you all a few episodes back that after an unfortunate puking incident, my boyfriend's cat, Sister Betty Lou, would be starting Smalls. True to my word, she has, and she's loving it. By day 2 on Smalls, Betty was wild for the stuff. And why wouldn't she be? Smalls is awesome because its protein-packed recipes are made with preservative-free ingredients that you would find in your fridge. Yet you get the convenience of Smalls being delivered right to your door. Smalls was started in 2017 by a couple of guys home cooking cat food in small batches for their friends. A few short years later, and they've served millions of meals to cats around the world. After making the switch to Smalls, 90% of cat owners reported overall health improvements. That's a big deal. The team at Smalls is so confident your cat will love their product that you can try it risk-free. That means they'll refund you if your cat won't eat their food. Now's the time to make the switch to Smalls. Head to smalls.com/COTC and use promo code COTC at checkout for 50% off your first order plus free shipping. That's the best offer you'll find, but you have to use my code COTC for 50% off your first order. One last time, that's promo code COTC for 50% off your first order plus free shipping. Captain Schroeder was not Jewish, nor had he any intention of joining the Nazi Party. When it was suggested to him that provisions for the trip should be of lesser quality and the entertainment be curtailed, Schroeder loaded the ship with the usual high-quality fare and menu of entertainment choices. His instructions to his 231-person crew on this voyage were equally in violation of Nazi protocol. The Jewish passengers were to be treated as were all passengers on the Hamburg America cruise line, with courtesy and respect, and with the express desire that their trip should be pleasant and comfortable. Solmeninger remembered,
One of the strange things was, you know, we went to have breakfast, and the waiters were all Germans, and they treated us like normal people, you know, not like Jewish people, just like passengers. It was, the first day was sort of shocking because that's not what we were used to from Germans anymore.
Wiesel was emphatic about how important Schroeder was then and later when things got increasingly difficult.
The hero of the story is a German, a star of the merchant marine, the young 37-year-old captain of a large, magnificent transatlantic passenger vessel. His name is Gustav Schroeder. He made moral history, and he will be remembered.
At least one man on board had every intention to ignore the captain's direct order to be kind to the Jews. Otto Schiendick, a ship steward, was also charged with being the leader of the Nazi Party during their trip. That meant he took pains to make them uncomfortable, showing Nazi propaganda films early in the trip and loudly encouraging the singing of party songs so no one forgot who was in charge back home. The passengers also had to endure the constant presence in the ballroom and dining halls of a prominent picture of Hitler in a place of honor, as well as all too familiar swastika flags hanging from the ship's flagpoles. Schroeder, in turn, ordered the portrait removed when Jewish prayer services were conducted in the same hall. The ever-loyal party man, Schiendick, took note, hoping to inform on Schroeder to ruin his career, or worse. Schroeder paid no mind. He oversaw his ship. That was maritime law. Now, with Cuba dawdling upon their arrival, Schroeder had to begin weighing his options. He knew that returning home was out of the question. Some of those aboard had been released from the camps, given only days to leave Germany if they vowed never to return. They would be dead men immediately on landing in Hamburg. Others, some hunted by the Gestapo for various transgressions, were at equal risk. And the remainders, as most knew, weren't going to be safe for long. Wiesel explained,
They could not be protected by law, since the law was the enemy. It was lawful to deprive them of their livelihood, of their safety, of their joy, of their hope, and in short, of all that today we could call their basic human rights.
Two of those on the ship were Renata and Evelyn Aber, ages 7 and 5 respectively, traveling alone to meet their father, Dr. Max Aber, who had traveled to Cuba ahead of them. They were looked after on board by a mother and daughter who had agreed at the Hamburg dockside to take on the task. It was not a coincidence that during the voyage, a new wave of anti-Semitism had been stoked in Cuba by the 30 or so Nazi agents posted there, working the press and the authorities into a lather about the impending trouble that the ship's passengers would bring them. In short, the agents told Cuba that Germany wasn't sending over their best people. It was part of a plan devised by Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's Reich Minister of Propaganda. He knew before they even set sail that the Jews would not be allowed in. He also had faith that the United States, still staunchly isolationist and having already allowed its annual quota of 25,957 German refugees into the country, probably an inflated number given the situation in Europe, would refuse to let them in. The point Goebbels was trying to make would be obvious: expose the hypocrisy of other nations who would criticize German anti-Semitic policies while also refusing to accept Jewish immigrants into their own countries. See, they could say, Germany's not the only country that doesn't want Jewish people around. So carefully planned was this that Cuba's Decree 937 had been signed by President Federico Bru on May 5th, before the St. Louis had even sailed. And the link between the decree and the ship couldn't be denied because it was right there in the name. Like I said, there were 937 Jewish people aboard the St. Louis. Bru was juggling his own problems and priorities when he signed the decree. Politically, he was at odds with his Secretary of State, Juan Ramos, who saw humanitarian reasons for allowing the passengers to be absorbed into Cuba, a stance which was at odds with a public that feared more mouths to feed, especially if they were not Catholic. All of them were, for some reason or another, wrestling with the powerful Cuban Director of General Immigration, Manuel Benitez Gonzalez. We will refer to him as Benitez per Spanish custom. Benitez had long been in the business of making money from selling visas that allowed entry into Cuba through what amounted to his own immigration bureau. Estimates of the proceeds from his graft neared $1 million in 1939, or $22 million in today's money. He was the one who had signed the passenger visas and landing permits and now assured those on board that they were valid, despite Decree 937. President Brew insisted that the decree was valid and legal, and Benitez was full of it. Then he suddenly made himself unavailable for further discussion to a whole raft of people trying to negotiate on the St. Louis's behalf. Consular services, as well as relief agencies, specifically the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, known at the time colloquially as the Joint, had been involved since the ship set sail, and they smelled trouble. The Joint's work was led by Lawrence Berenson from New York and Morris Troper from Europe. Together, they would save thousands of lives before the war was over, but this was still 1939, and it was becoming a hand-to-hand combat already to place Jews somewhere besides Germany. Captain Schroeder, meanwhile, admitted doctors on board to check the health of each passenger, and like Cuban authorities, check their papers. Schroeder had been visited by Louis Clacy, a shipping agent for his line, who was absolutely certain that bribery to the right people was the answer to the problem. Cuban police placed 24-hour guards at the base of the ladder so passengers couldn't depart the ship. Schroeder then convened a small passenger advisory group that could meet to discuss the quote-unquote fluid situation and give counsel to Schroeder as to what and when to tell the rest of the passengers of the ongoing crisis. Shaking up things straight away, at 3:30 that second afternoon, a launch approached the ship. An official-looking man got off, chatted with the purser, that's an officer who keeps the accounts on passenger vessels, who then announced over the ship's PA that Mrs. Maida Bon, her 2 children, and 4 named Cuban passengers needed to report to his office. Then, within minutes, those 7 people got their bags and left the ship. Schroeder was enraged. How did that happen? The purser said the official just looked at their papers, and not too closely, and told them they were free to go. Max Luva had boarded the ship with his wife Elisa and their 2 children, 17-year-old Ruth and 12-year-old Fritz. Luva had been an attorney in Germany until he was removed from practice a year earlier. He had kept his family fed by preparing legal work for non-Jewish lawyers, something that was illegal. The Gestapo found out and he was forced into hiding. He'd spent some time in a concentration camp where the soles of his feet had been beaten so badly that he walked with a permanent limp. Leaving that camp had been unlikely enough. Getting his family aboard the St. Louis had been masterful, with him showing up at the last minute to slide past the authorities and onto the ship. But the months on the run had worn on him. Distrustful, paranoid, jittery, and brooding, Luva was increasingly falling apart. So much so that his wife feared he was becoming unreachable, maybe even schizophrenic. She did her best to hide it from her children and anyone who came by to check their health or their papers. In the Cuban harbor, a flotilla of small craft now surrounded the St. Louis. Some were officials on some kind of business. Others were relatives who had been waiting on shore for the arrival of family. They shouted out names and waved at those they knew on board. Everyone was just looking for information. One couple, the Bergmans, had sent their dog Oshi ahead of them on a freighter out of Bremen. A man whom the Bergmans had trusted to keep Oshi until they arrived motored out on a skiff and held the dog up so the couple could see the little white fox terrier. No, the Bergmans could not get off the boat, and no, Oshi could not get on. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Athena Club. True story time. I love these razors so much that I used my own code to re-up on refills, and that caused some trouble because the code wasn't active yet. Now my code has been changed because they were all worried that my code had been leaked, which it had, by me to me. All this is to say, I love these razors. Athena's Club's razors has this water-activated serum surrounding the blade that is gentle on my skin, leaving it moisturized, super smooth, and bump-free. Plus, it has built-in skin guards that help prevent razor burn and reduce irritation. I get 0 razor bumps with this razor. That's why I love it. The best part is the razor kit is only $10, but don't let that price fool you. This razor feels expensive. It's got a fancy-feeling ergonomic handle, 2 of those 5-blade patented refills, and a game-changing magnetic hook for easy storage. Ready to upgrade your shaving experience? Switch to the best razor on the market and show your skin you care with Athena Club. Head over to athenaclub.com to try their award-winning razor kit. Get 30% off with code CENTURIES at checkout. You can also find Athena Club razors at your local Target store. Trust me, you won't look back. Happy shaving! Two ships, the British Orduna and the French Flandre, soon arrived in Havana Harbor as well to deliver their own contingent of Jewish passengers per their valid visas. Schroeder had practically raced these ships to Cuba, having been urged via company cable to increase the speed and take a quicker route around the Azores in order to be first in line, given the fluidity of the Cuban mood on accepting refugees. The Orduna disembarked 48 passengers, but left shortly thereafter in search of another port for their 72 remaining evacuees. The Flandre did not appear to leave anyone in Cuba before it, too, departed for a more receptive climate. On board the ship, the mood darkened. It didn't help that it was hot. This was Cuba, and it was 100 degrees on deck. Max Luva grew more agitated, certain he was being watched full-time, certain that Gestapo was aboard to pounce on him and send him back to a camp. Actually, Gestapo was on board, 8 of them in fact, posing as firemen. But there is no real indication that Luva was even on their radar. Others were. The firemen had gone out of their way to harass certain passengers, instituting checks on the contents of their cabins. These checks amounted to opening suitcases, throwing personal possessions around, destroying photos and letters, and, in some cases, beating those singled out for all the terror they could impose before they could get off the ship. The committee may or may not have known about these roustings, but just then were more concerned about what to do to get everyone off the boat. They decided to reach out via telegram to those who might be able to influence the one person who could alter their fate. The first telegram signed by the committee was to the wife of President Brew, mentioning explicitly the children on board. Quote, "Your woman's feelings give us hope that you will not refuse our request." End quote. Public figures throughout the world got telegrams too, though they thought they'd wait to see if they needed to implore FDR to help them. Carbon copies of the telegrams were posted throughout the ship so passengers could see that something was being done. Maybe it would bring on a sense of hope? If so, it was short-lived. That afternoon, around 3, Max Luva slit his wrists with a straight razor and walked calmly past the doctor's office and onto deck A, screaming as he jumped over the side into the busy waters below. From the port side bridge, Captain Schroeder heard the scream and immediately issued a man overboard alert. A steward, who was a good swimmer, spotted Lowe thrashing and bleeding while yelling, "Murderers! They will never get me!" The seaman fought rough waters, as well as the flailing man who insisted he wanted to die, to pull him to the surface and held him there until a police launch came close enough to haul them both in. By now, the upper deck was full of people watching the desperation they felt be lived out below. 2 people had already died on board, one Jewish passenger of heart failure, likely brought on by years of living in Nazi Germany, and a member of the kitchen crew, a Russian, who had thrown himself off the ship, though no one knew exactly why. It was later speculated that he had crossed the Nazis on board and they had manufactured the suicide. Put in an ambulance when the police reached shore, Luva was taken to a facility where he was sedated, restrained, and put under guard. The Cubans refused Elisa Luva's request to see her husband. The American ambassador to Cuba, meanwhile, busied himself with trying to talk to the Cubans without the ability to say that his country had asked him to. Tricky shit if you're a diplomat, but Ambassador Butler Wright, acting without instructions, was able to get to Cuba's Secretary of State Ramos to ask him about his feelings on the matter. Ramos replied, quote, "My personal opinion is that the aliens on the St. Louis should be admitted. If they are not, the outcry in the press and the statements which would be made about the way the Cuban government conducted itself would be most derogatory," end quote. Upon returning to his office, Wright contacted U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull to inform him that the quote-unquote awkwardness of the situation was becoming clear to the Cubans. It was the best way he could think of to tell Hull that Cuba might fold and FDR might be off the hook. Max Luva's rescuer returned to the ship to inform all that Max would probably live. Good news. Especially since the American press had latched on to the Luva story and thus energized a whole range of interested parties in the U.S. who started to send telegrams to anyone they could think of to change the fate of those on the St. Louis. A 10-year-old even wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt to explain that her house had extra room, so they could take 3 of the refugees. Could she pass that information to the right people? Well, the right people weren't doing much, and the passengers knew it. A Jewish doctor on board attempted suicide, a syringe and empty ampules of something by his bedside. This was news that Captain Schroeder, in consultation with the passenger committee, decided to keep from everyone else. They also decided to illuminate the ship's hull with floodlights during night hours and to have lifeboats lowered and ready for any other rescues of the desperate. In Gordon Thomas and Max Morgan Witt's definitive book, Voyage of the Damned, they noted that now more than a few passengers thought the St. Louis, quote, resembled a floating concentration camp, end quote. On the 5th day, lingering in Havana Harbor, nobody was coming and no one was going, except for Hildy Redding. She was a 27-year-old masseuse who had done very well for herself in Cuba. Her parents and boyfriend were on the ship, so, tired of waiting, she somehow got to Ramos, who listened to her pleas and managed to get her a few minutes on board. While there, she handed her parents her entire savings of $1,700, or about $37,000 in today's dollars, in hopes that it would help them survive this and whatever else was to come. If Ramos had allowed this, did that mean Brew was softening? Maybe. But that was the tiniest glimmer in a sea of abject despair. Nobody was opening their doors.
7 Latin American countries, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Panama, Paraguay, and Uruguay, were approached also.
Wiesel is so specific because blame, beyond Cuba and the U.S., needs to be acknowledged. Despair on a grand scale was fueled now by the dawning reality that the St. Louis and its incredibly vulnerable passengers could very well be going back to Germany any day now. The Washington Post weighed in, asking the U.S. government to come to its senses. It wrote,
"There are sanctuaries for birds and nature everywhere in the United States, except for over 900 persecuted human beings."
Even as the boat languished just offshore, President Brew sat in his office surrounded by American telegrams and the one that had been sent his wife, which had mentioned the children on board who were suffering. He and his wife, who had no children, were indeed heartbroken, thinking of the children on board in peril. Brew decided he was willing to negotiate. On June 1st, Brew told an American negotiator that first, the ship must leave the harbor. When it was outside of the territorial limits of Cuba, he would listen to, quote, any plan which covers the passengers' maintenance in the Cuban Republic until such time as they can go elsewhere, end quote. So much for thinking of the children. Now it was going to be about money. Schroeder received his orders to start his engines and go, but not too far. Schroeder's notice to passengers read, quote, The Cuban government has ordered us to leave the harbor. We shall depart at 10 a.m. Friday morning. But our departure does not mean discussions with the Cuban government are ended. Only by leaving Havana can negotiators continue working. The ship will continue to be in contact with all Jewish organizations and other official bodies. They will all continue to try to arrange a landing outside Germany. In the meantime, the ship will remain close to the American coast." End quote. Passengers wept openly as a last police launch approached the ship on Friday morning. 6 Jews, who obviously had powerful friends, the Annenberg name was mentioned, were quickly shepherded off the St. Louis. There were now 907 people left on the ship. Negotiations now boiled down to this. The Cubans wanted a bond to be cashed by the Cuban government if, and only if, the refugees had not left by a certain date or if they became a charge of the state during the time they were in Cuba. In other words, if it cost Cuba nothing, they could come to be exiled to the Isle of Pines, a former penal colony. The number of $50,000 was thrown out for the cash bond. The Cuban representative at the time casually mentioned it would take at least $150,000. Again, let me remind you that all kinds of people are talking to all kinds of other people, and this is going to get messy before the president of Cuba thinks they have a deal. Just know that on the day the St. Louis sailed out of the harbor, the New York Times was reporting it would likely take a figure of $500 per refugee, or $500,000 total, to get those passengers onto the sandy beaches of the island nation. All because, said Wiesel,
France does not want more refugees on its soil. Great Britain was in the middle of preparing a white book limiting Jewish immigration to Palestine. America held on to its cherished sacred quotas.
Into this fray leapt the Dominican Republic, offering their island nation up for about the same price. On Sunday, June 4th, the captain sailed his ship in increasingly larger circles around Havana to be ready to dash into the port as soon as the deal had been struck, hoping to disembark his passengers before anyone changed their minds. By the by, for the geographically challenged, the Florida coast is only about 90 miles from Cuba. On that day, the St. Louis steamed within 6 miles of Miami Beach, waiting to hear if the U.S. was in play. It was close enough to smell the rum and suntan oil. 90-year-old Herb Carliner remembered that sight like it was yesterday.
I promised myself I was 12 years old that when I gonna make it, I come back here and live here. I saw sand here, I saw a few palm trees, and then the wall, behind the wall was cars driving, and then the white hotels.
When a United States Coast Guard cutter came into view, those on board briefly believed that this was the news they had waited to hear from President Roosevelt. Instead, it directed Schroeder to withdraw. The vessel, the cable read, quote, was in violation of the crossing the territorial limits of the United States, end quote. Schroeder figured that meant there was no wiggle room there. At that time, a poll showed that 83% of the American people were against accepting more European refugees. Franklin Roosevelt, anxious to win a third term, was unlikely to go against their wishes. Things got a tad confused here yet again. When the negotiators met on that Sunday, the Cuban president reminded that the $500 cash deposit per person was expected, but so was another $150,000 to provide for food and shelter while those people were in the country. The number of refugees had also expanded because, remember, there had been 2 ships that arrived from Europe just after the St. Louis, and some of those passengers boarded. Numbers were getting big, and patience was growing thin. Brew gave everyone until noon on Tuesday, the 6th, to wind this thing up, or the deal was off. The Associated Press sent a cable to Schroeder, quote, "Kindly inform us your intentions in view of world interest in your situation," end quote. He replied, quote, "My intention is to do all possible to alleviate mounting concern of my passengers whose only wish is to find a home," end quote. For all of the hours left, all sorts of cogs were churning in all kinds of places, private and public, local and transatlantic. At noon on Tuesday, the Cuban presidential palace informed the world that its government had terminated the matter. What about the Americans? The answer was simple. You can't dock in Miami, neither can you dock in New York. Pick any American port. The answer was a firm no. The same was true with any Canadian port. Schroeder was running out of provisions to feed everyone, and frankly, he was also running out of time. His bosses wanted him back in New York as soon as possible to start the spring Caribbean cruise season. Life, and went on. By 11:30 that night, Schroeder was ordered by his bosses to sail back to Hamburg immediately. The Joint Committee in New York had heard vague offers from the Panama Canal Zone and from Honduras offering to house the refugees. No one took up the challenge of making those work. In those long days back across the Atlantic, Schroeder came up with his own plan. He would, he decided, run the ship onto Beachy Head on England's rocky Sussex coast, set the ship on fire, and evacuate the passengers, making it look like an accident. England would have no choice then but to retain those stranded. He told no one. Others on board had also made plans. Led by one of the men who had already been in a concentration camp, a group of Jewish men overpowered the helmsman piloting the ship and demanded he and the captain turn away from Europe. Schroeder said he would issue no such order. Besides, they had not captured the engine room, and that would be difficult with so few men. "Leave now, and this episode is over. No damage done," the captain said. They replied, "Captain, we cannot return to Germany." He knew that. Later, moved by the incident, Schroeder informed a few members of his crew of his own plan, explaining that they needed to treat it as if it were a real emergency. On Saturday, the helmsman, who had been accosted on the ship's bridge, hanged himself from a beam in the ship's locker room. And the Joint Committee's European chief, Morris Troper, reported he had seen all the politicians and royalty he could appeal to. Everyone had said no to the St. Louis. On Sunday, Belgium changed its mind. And so did Holland, France, and England. On Monday, it was determined that 181 of the passengers were to go to Holland, 224 to France, 288 to England, and 214 to Belgium. On Tuesday, June 13th, the ship got the news. On behalf of all of its passengers, it messaged back, quote, "Gratitude is as immense as the ocean on which we have been traveling since May 13th, end quote. 2 months after passengers of the MS St. Louis managed to finally disembark, Hitler invaded Poland. Of the 937 Jews originally on the vessel, 620 were returned to the European continent, which was shortly to be run over by Nazi troops. A total of 254 of those who returned died in Nazi concentration camps, 84 who had been taken in by Belgium, 84 who had sought shelter in Holland, and 86 who had deemed themselves lucky to be accepted by France. Great Britain's gesture to those on board made sure that most of their allotment survived the war. In 2012, the U.S. Department of State formally apologized for not allowing the passengers to disembark in this country. On hand were 14 survivors who had managed to live through the war and had settled here. 6 years after that, in 2018, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau issued a formal apology for his country's inactions. 6 million Jews perished in the Nazi concentration camps in a systemic effort to wipe the race and religion off the map. Hundreds of thousands of others were displaced, ruined, injured, both mentally and physically. Captain Schroeder's career was never the same. Once he returned the St. Louis to Hamburg, he was reassigned to a desk job and never went to sea again. In a strange twist, he was investigated as a possible war criminal as Germany aimed to denazify itself after the war. Ultimately, he was acquitted as the passengers on the St. Louis rallied to testify on his behalf. Posthumously, he was honored as righteous among nations by the Israel Holocaust Memorial Yad Vashem. The $1,700 Hildy Redding had given her parents on board was instrumental in keeping them alive during the war. The suicidal Max Luva lived, stranded as he was in Cuba for the war. After he recovered enough, he had moved to Great Britain. Based on an England and Wales registry I found from 1940, it appears he was reunited there with his family until he died 2 years later from heart failure, likely linked to a suicide attempt. Elisa and their 2 children eventually settled in America. I need to settle this one on a brighter note, though, so I'll close with this. The Bergmans, the couple who had sent their terrier to Cuba ahead of them, survived the war and were reunited with their dog Oshi. To research this case, journalist Amy Wilson read Voyage of the Damned by Gordon Thomas and Max Morgan-Witz. She listened to Ali Wiesel's 2015 lecture on the anniversary of the tragedy of the St. Louis on 92 NY+. She watched a few documentaries on the St. Louis and also perused American newspapers from the era. Crimes of the Centuries is available early and ad-free through Grab Bag Collab. Join us at patreon.com/GrabBagCollab to hear not just exclusive content related to this show, but to also get access to several other shows on our profit-sharing network. Unless noted in the citations, this case was researched and written by me, Amber Hunt, and produced by Amanda Rossman and Henry Lavoie. Original music is by Bruce Hunt, Andrew Higley, and occasionally by my son, Hunt Van Benscoten. Other music comes from Soundstripe and Epidemic Sound. If you like the show, help us out by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts. For more information or to recommend a case, go to centuriespod.com. On Instagram, we're at centuriespod, and check out our Crimes of the Centuries podcast Facebook page.